In this video, I explain to you how life in the Middle Ages was shaped and which important events and developments formed society. We look at how people lived back then, from the peasants in the countryside to the knights and kings. The Middle Ages was a period that lasted roughly from 500 to 1500 AD. People lived very differently than today, without modern technology like cell phones or cars. There were many small kingdoms and principalities that often fought wars against each other. Most people believed in the church, and God played a big role in their daily lives. Most people in the Middle Ages lived in the countryside and were peasants. They worked hard in the fields to have food like bread or vegetables. Their houses were simple, often made of wood and clay. Children had to help early on instead of going to school. In the later Middle Ages, cities became increasingly important. Craftsmen like blacksmiths or bakers moved there and sold their goods. The cities had narrow streets and were often dirty because there was no proper sewage system. Still, they attracted many people looking for a better life. Knights were the warriors of the Middle Ages and wore heavy armor. They often lived in castles, which were like small stone fortresses. These castles protected them from enemies and showed their power. Many boys dreamed of becoming knights, but the training was tough. Kings were the rulers over entire countries in the Middle Ages. They had a lot of power, but had to keep good relations with nobles and the church. They often waged wars to gain more land. People had to obey the king and pay taxes. The church was extremely important in the Middle Ages and had almost as much power as the kings. Priests and monks told people how they should live to get into heaven. Many were afraid of hell if they did not obey. Large churches and monasteries were built everywhere. Children in the Middle Ages had little time to play. Most had to work, for example in the fields or at home. School existed only for rich children, and they mostly learned from the church. Games like ball throwing or simple wooden dolls were still popular. People in the Middle Ages ate a lot of bread, which was often hard and dark. They had soups with vegetables or sometimes meat if they were lucky. Peasants had little food and often starved, while nobles celebrated big feasts. Water was unsafe, so many drank beer or wine. Clothing in the Middle Ages was simple and made of wool or linen. Peasants often wore brown or gray tunics that got dirty quickly. Rich people had colorful robes with embroidery to show their wealth. Shoes were mostly made of leather and uncomfortable. Diseases were a big problem in the Middle Ages because there were no modern medicines. Many died from the plague, which spread quickly. Doctors knew little and tried herbs or bloodletting. Hygiene was poor, making everything worse. The Black Plague was a terrible disease that killed millions of people. It came in the mid-14th century and spread through fleas and rats. Entire villages died out and people were panicked. Some believed it was God's punishment. There were constant wars in the Middle Ages between countries or nobles. Soldiers fought with swords, bows, and lances, and it was very brutal. Often it was about land, power, or honor. Ordinary people suffered the most. The Crusades were wars in which Christians went to the Holy Land. They wanted to reclaim Jerusalem from the Muslims because it was important to them. Many knights died on the way or in battle. The Crusades lasted over 200 years. At markets, people exchanged goods like fabric, spices, or animals. Merchants traveled far, sometimes even to Asia. Coins became more important, but many also bartered directly. Markets were loud, colorful, and full of life. Craftsmen like carpenters or potters had important jobs in the Middle Ages. They made everything by hand, without machines, and it took a long time. Boys learned the trade from their fathers or a master. Good craftsmen were highly sought after in cities. Women in the Middle Ages mostly had fewer rights than men. They took care of the household and children or helped in the fields. Noblewomen could sometimes have influence, but only rarely. Some nuns lived in monasteries and learned to read and write. There were hardly any schools in the Middle Ages, and few could read. The church mostly taught rich boys Latin and religion. Later, universities emerged, but only for the elite. Knowledge was often written by hand in books. Books were rare and expensive in the Middle Ages because monks copied them. They wrote with quills on parchment, which took months. The pages were often decorated with colorful pictures. Only the church and the wealthy could afford them. In the Middle Ages, things like the wheeled plow or windmills were invented. These helped farmers produce more food. Glasses also appeared to improve eyesight. Still, progress was slow. Feudalism was the system organizing society. The king gave land to nobles who had to fight for it. Peasants worked the land and gave a part of their harvest. Everyone had their place and little freedom. People in the Middle Ages loved festivals despite their hard lives. During harvest time or church holidays, they danced and sang. There were markets, games, and sometimes plays. Nobles celebrated with big banquets and tournaments. Music in the Middle Ages was simple, with flutes, drums, or lutes. Peasants sang songs while working, and nobles listened to minstrels. Dances were wild and fun, often in groups. The church did not always like this, but allowed it. Animals were very important to people in the Middle Ages. Horses helped with travel, cows gave milk, and dogs guarded farms. Many also had chickens for eggs or pigs for meat. Wild animals like wolves were a danger. People had respect and fear of nature. Storms or floods were seen as signs from God. Many believed in witches, fairies, or ghosts. Superstition was everywhere, and people tried to protect themselves with rituals. There were no clocks like today in the Middle Ages. People used the sun's position, or hourglasses, to estimate time. Church bells rang to divide the day. Time was not as important to most as it is now. Travel in the Middle Ages was slow and dangerous. Most walked or rode horses on bad roads. Robbers often lurked for travelers, and weather made it hard. Only merchants or pilgrims traveled far. Knights showed their strength and skill at tournaments. They fought with lances on horseback or with swords. The crowd cheered loudly, and winners got prizes. It was like a sports festival, but often with injuries. Art in the Middle Ages was mostly made for the church. There were colorful stained glass windows, statues, and paintings of saints. Everything was meant to remind people of God. Craftsmen were artists and worked with great effort. People spoke different dialects in the Middle Ages, like Old German. Stories about heroes like King Arthur were told. Many could not write, so tales were passed on orally. In the evening by the fire, everyone listened eagerly. Around 1500, many things changed, and the Middle Ages came to an end. New ideas like the Renaissance emerged, and the world became more modern. Discoveries like America changed trade. It was the beginning of a new era.